Teamwork makes the dream work. Abby, turning it over to you.
Thank you so much, Kim, and thank you, Maurice, for hosting this webinar. I'm pleased to be here to share some information with this group. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. All right. Hopefully that worked. That looked good, everybody. As Kim said, I have the pleasure of chairing the Early Childhood Educator Pay Equity Fund Task Force. It's a mouthful. And that group came together several years ago when the Pay Equity Fund was first established to help provide some recommendations to the council and the mayor and OSSI on how to implement the fund. And then at the beginning of this calendar year, that task force came back together to initially to look at some ways that we could tweak and improve the approach to the fund. And in the midst of that, our charge changed a little bit as the mayor and council made some moves that significantly changed the budget of the Pay Equity Fund. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what the task force's most immediate charge is and where we are on that. Those of you who were at Tuesday evening's task force meeting have seen the information I'll be sharing tonight, but hopefully we'll have a chance to engage a little bit on it. And I'm going to go through this relatively quickly so that we can save as much time for questions and answers as possible.
Abby, just a reminder for our interpreters, if you could speak at a more calm cadence.
Yeah.
I know, don't worry about the time. We'll work through it, but it's more important that everybody understand what you're saying.
Thanks, Kim, and thanks for that reminder. I do sometimes, my mouth goes a little faster than my brain sometimes. So to give folks a sense of, where our task force work is, the immediate deadline that I just referred to is a September 30th deadline that we have to provide the mayor and the council with some short-term recommendations about how to adjust the Pay Equity Fund to fit within the new budget parameters that we have. So that is what I'm going to focus on in my comments this evening. That is not all that the task force is doing. So after we submit these recommendations, the task force will continue to meet to focus on some of the outstanding questions we have for how the Pay Equity Fund operates. I neglected to say at the beginning, the task force is made up of 17 individuals who all bring different experience and expertise that's relevant to this work, including a number of folks who are directors or owners of childcare facilities, and also educators who are in the classroom every day. So we have that perspective very well represented on the task force. These are the guiding principles that the task force adopted in 2021 and reaffirmed when we came back together this year. And I'm not going to go through all of them, but want to note a couple of specific focus areas that I think are really important. One is that we are committed to centering those furthest from opportunity and to disrupt systemic inequities. So when we are making our policy recommendations, that's something that is central to how we approach the work. And also to think about all of the early educators within our diverse delivery model. So whether that's people working in centers, large or small, or in child development homes or expanded homes, all of those educators are core to the work that we're doing. This is just a quick update on where we are in terms of the number of providers and facilities who are participating right now in the Pay Equity Fund. And so what you see, the first and third charts here are broken down by providers. The middle chart is broken down by facilities, as since some providers have multiple facilities, those numbers don't all match up. But you can get a sense of the participation. And in particular, I want to note that among subsidy providers, all but 4 subsidy providers are currently participating. which means that we really have reached almost that entire part of the market, which I think is something we feel really good about. So the challenge that we're facing is that because the pay equity fund has been so successful, we now have some fiscal pressures, some financial pressures that we have to address. So essentially what has happened is because so many providers have been interested in participating, and because we have seen an increase in educators who are earning their credentials, the cost of the pay equity fund has increased over time to the degree that the budget that the mayor and council have allocated for the pay equity fund will not cover its costs. So what you see here is a quick overview of that, where as of right now, with the current formula that we're using, we have a projected shortfall of $17.5 million. And then we need to add to that some other pressures that we know exist, one of which is, as many of you know, the current pay equity fund credential requirements are not exactly aligned with OSSI's new licensing requirements. And so there are more people who qualify for the AA degree under OSSI's licensing than qualify under the pay equity fund, simply because of what was written into the legislative language, the law that that governs this, and so that increases that projected shortfall even more. I'm going to give you a little bit of visibility into what that looks like. So what you see here is the number of educators as of this month, when OSSI is making the Q4 payment, the number of educators at each of the levels. So based on their credential and based on their role. And what you see in the right-hand column is the estimated numbers of each of those categories if we were to align the pay equity fund credentials with the updated licensing requirements. So you see, for example, that there's a significant increase in the number of people with associate degrees that would happen, which again would increase the cost of the fund. Same thing if you look at the BA level, there's a significant increase. So those are things that are going to add cost pressures to the overall cost of the fund. And so we need to build that in to ensure that all of those folks who've worked hard to get to that credential level are actually being compensated at the correct level. So given all of that, the DC Council, as part of the Budget Support Act, named a few changes to the pay equity fund and specified the charge for the task force to be able to deliver by the end of this month. So the most significant thing for everyone to understand is that the funding level in the budget is $70 million annually, so each year, starting in in fiscal year 25, which begins in October, and over the course of 4 years stays at that $70 million. And that's really significant because it means that when we think about building in increases, that is not an option for the report that we need to deliver to council. We need to demonstrate to the council and to the mayor that we can stay within that $70 million for each of the next 4 years. Now, I'll pause to note that on this call, there are many early childhood advocates who have worked really hard to get us to this point in terms of pay equity, and who I am very confident will continue to work hard to try and increase that number. And that work should happen for sure. The task force is charged with operating within that number. So everything that you will see here tonight assumes that $70 million is flat for those 4 years. So in addition to allocating $70 million overall for the pay equity fund, the Budget Support Act also specifies that 12 million of that goes towards healthcare for childcare, which is the program that provides healthcare for many early childhood educators, either through their employer or as individuals. The other thing that happens in the Budget Support Act is it eliminates the minimum salaries for early educators with less than a CDA. So the assistant teachers who have not yet earned their CDA would be at minimum wage based on what's in the Budget Support Act, which is a change from the current pay equity fund. And then the other thing that the Budget Support Act does is it changes the minimum salaries for educators with a bachelor's degree, for teachers with a bachelor's degree, to the same minimum salary as teachers with an associate degree. It also specifically tells the task force that we can propose a different approach, but if we do not propose a different approach before September 30th, this would be the default. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the discussions that task force members have had about what our alternative approach might be. The BSA also changes the language that in its last iteration, it tied the minimum BA salaries to the DC Public Schools collectively bargained salary scale, so that someone with a BA who was part of the pay equity fund and was serving as a teacher would also would have the same level of salary as a DCPS teacher. It changes that and instead asks the task force to propose a compensation scale that takes into account the compensation of employees of DCPS and also of public charter schools who teach pre-K and kindergarten. So it broadens the group of comparison teachers beyond DC public schools. So that's basically our charge. So I'm going to share a little bit about how we're approaching that. So as we think about the ways that we can reduce the total cost of the pay equity fund, which again we have to do in order to meet our charge, there are three big categories for how we can do that. The first is changing the CDF, the Child Development Facility payment formula. So this is how we figure out how much money each child development facility gets. And there are ways to trim costs by changing elements of that formula. And I'll talk about what those might be. The second is to look at the other cost drivers that are outside of that funding formula, which are the healthcare for childcare that I talked about, and also the costs of OSSI administering the program. So OSSI needs some funding in order to be able to actually administer the program, make sure that they distribute the payments, that they're collecting information, that they're monitoring, et cetera. So that's a second category we can look at. And then the third is making changes in the minimum required salaries. So that means what the floor, the minimum amount that any educator needs to be paid if a facility is participating in the pay equity fund. So I'm going to talk about how we approach each of those three categories as a task force and where we landed as of our meeting 2 nights ago.
And just a bit more slowly, Abby. Thank you so much.
Okay. Sorry, Kim. Thank you. So this should be pretty familiar to people on this call, but this is basically the approach that we take to get the funding to child development facilities. So essentially, OSSI, through a formula that, again, there's an existing formula and we're looking at potential changes to it, calculates how much each facility will get each quarter for the pay equity fund. That money goes to childcare providers who use that money in combination with all of the other revenue sources they have. So that includes tuition payments, that includes subsidy payments for those who participate in subsidy, and it may include other revenues, fundraising, other funds through federal funds, Head Start, et cetera. So there are all kinds of different revenues that a provider might have, and they use all of that of those resources as part of paying salaries to their educators that meet or exceed those minimum salaries, the requirements laid out by the Pay Equity Fund, depending upon an educator's role and credential. So as we think about ways to shift that, that first category I talked about is around the payroll formula. So currently, this is what the payroll formula looks like. Again, this hopefully will be pretty familiar, at least to owners and directors. The way that the formula works, there's a base award, which is a dollar amount that is connected to the particular role and, sorry, dropped my computer mouse. That's connected to an educator's role and credential. So for example, if there's an assistant teacher who has a CDA, there's a particular dollar amount that's associated with that. If there is a teacher with a BA, there's a dollar amount associated with that. So all of those are added together to create the base award for each individual provider. Then there are two elements of the formula that go to every provider currently this year, regardless of any of the characteristics of the provider. One is an administrative enhancement that is 15% of that base award. And that's basically intended to cover the payroll costs that automatically increase, the payroll tax costs that automatically increase when an employee's salary increases. So in addition to providing the salary increase, because that additional cost comes with that higher salary, the formula delivers an administrative enhancement. And then the FY24 supplement, which as its name indicates, was a one-time deal for this last fiscal year. It added a 30% addition of all the other components. So whatever the award was that a provider was going to get, they got 30% more as this FY24 supplement in order to support the initial implementation of the Pay Equity Fund as OSSI was figuring out more effective ways to allocate dollars. So those go to everybody currently. And then there is the equity adjustment, which in the current formula directs additional dollars to providers who are serving children who are receiving childcare subsidies. And so at the moment, that means that depending upon the percentage of your licensed capacity that is occupied by children receiving subsidy, you get an additional dollar amount added on to your overall award. So that's how it works right now. So the task force was looking at that formula to identify what are ways to change some of these components that could both reduce overall costs, remembering that we have to cut some significant amount of money, but also try to better target dollars to go to providers based on need. So given people's different situations, providers' different situations, there may be more or less access to resources, and people's costs may be higher or lower. And the idea is, are there ways that we can better target funds to reflect that need? So among the things that we have been looking at, and that the task force has provisionally recommended as of our meeting 2 nights ago, one is to align the administrative enhancement with the legally required tax and benefit costs associated with the higher pay. So 15%, which is where it was a little bit higher than that. So that would save us some money. And then the FY24 supplement, which was always communicated as a one-time adjustment, to eliminate that. Understanding that the way that supplement was delivered was a very blunt instrument. It went to everybody regardless of need. And so if we can think more carefully about and more precisely about where need is, we could direct our dollars more effectively. So in doing that, we looked at what are other ways to target funds through an expanded equity adjustment. So again, right now, the only equity adjustment that exists is a percentage of a facility's capacity utilized by children receiving child care subsidy. And that is currently multiplied by the facility's base award and by 60% of the base award. So you get a 60% weight depending upon the percent of enrollment occupied by children receiving subsidy. The task force is talking about making 3 potential shifts. One is to add an equity adjustment that reflects the percentage of licensed capacity that is infant and toddler, given that serving infants and toddlers is more expensive, and that is also the more significant need that DC has in terms of childcare availability. And then secondly, adding a new equity adjustment that would be targeting child development homes and expanded homes, understanding that the margins for those facilities are particularly slim. And so having some additional support would help stabilize that market. And then the third thing that the task force is recommending is to increase the value of the existing subsidy equity adjustment above 60%, so that there would be more of a targeting of resources to facilities that serve children on subsidy. So the other things that the task force has discussed and that we have incorporated into the provisional recommendations as of this week. So one is for providers that operate less than the full year. So there are some providers that are school year only. Right now, those providers have been funded as though they operate all year, and this would adjust that so that it would align with the amount of time that they're actually in session. The same thing with part-time staff. So if there's a part-time staff member, the facilities would not get the same amount as they would for a full-time staff member. And then the second, the sort of the middle column here, we are looking at providers that charge at the very high end of the tuition distribution, so above the 90th percentile, recognizing that gives them access to more resources and that they're likely serving more affluent families and children, to make those providers ineligible for portions of the fund. So they would still have access to the base award and to the equity adjustments, the subsidy equity adjustment, but it would shift to make them not eligible for certain portions of the funding. And I'll get into some of those details in just a moment. And then the last piece is eliminating the FY24 supplement, as I mentioned. So taking that blunt instrument and eliminating that as part of the cost, and then redirecting the remaining resources more equitably. So here's what that looks like right now in terms of the provisional approach that the task force has landed on. So there's still the base award that is based on the specific role and credential levels of the actual staff members who are in a facility. Right sizing those awards for part-time staff and for part-time and for part-year programs, as I mentioned. The equity, sorry, I'm going to go to the administrative enhancement. The administrative enhancement would still be there, but it would go down to 12%, which instead of 15%, which again is aligned with the legally required payroll taxes, including the increase in taxes for folks participating in the paid leave program. Providers that charge tuition above the 90th percentile would not be eligible for that administrative enhancement. And then the equity adjustment would increase the weight for serving subsidized children and add a weight for serving infants and toddlers. Again, those who are at the 90th, above the 90th percentile would not be eligible for the infant toddler weight, and add a weight for all child development homes and expanded homes, and eliminate the FY24 supplement. So that's the change to the formula that we are proposing. The other pieces of the funding for the pay equity fund, the other big pieces are healthcare for childcare, which, as I mentioned, is at $12 million, which is a cut, but would allow the DC Health Benefits Exchange to continue to provide the same service that they're providing right now. So everyone who's currently enrolled should be able to continue to be enrolled. And then on the OSSI administrative cost side, OSSI put together a budget which would allow them to reallocate a portion of that administrative cost that is written into the law to funds that would go to facilities. So out of $3.5 million, which OSSI is originally allocated, they have a budget of $2 million, which would allow them to administer the program and would allow $1.5 million to go back into the facilities funding. So that is something that the task force also approved. So the last piece of this is minimum salaries. So minimum salaries, again, are the floor, so the bottom level salary that facilities participating in the pay equity fund must pay their educators based on role and credential. And so these are the current minimum salaries. I want to emphasize that these minimum salaries will continue to be in place for the first quarter of this next fiscal year, which means starting in October through December. So for the rest of 2024 calendar year, these minimum salaries will continue to be in place, and the payments that OSSI is getting out this month to providers should support those minimum salaries. So nothing should change for those educators through the end of December. However, the task force has looked at how to reduce these overall costs, and in order to get to the budget number we need to get to, doing those changes in the formula doesn't quite get us there. So the task force has looked at a couple of options for how to shift minimum salaries. So as a reminder, the Budget Support Act that the council put out has a placeholder which would change two of the minimum salaries. One, it would bring the minimum salary for people who do not yet have a CDA down to minimum wage. And then it would also bring the bachelor's degree teachers down to the level of an associate's degree. So that's if the task force does not recommend anything else, this is what would happen. The task force was interested in looking at other ways of approaching this. And so we looked at a few different options. We looked at an across-the-board reduction, which would cut salaries for everyone who has a CDA or higher by the same percentage amount. So it would be across the board. Another option that we looked at was in the same way that assistant teachers who don't yet have a CDA and so are not meeting OSSI's licensing requirements, that there's a reduction for their salaries. That also a similar approach would be taken for the teachers in centers and expanded homes who do not yet have an AA, which is the minimum licensing requirement for them. If they only have a CDA, it would lower their salaries to the level of the CDA teachers who are assistant teachers. So that was a second thing that the task force considered. And then again, the third that we initially looked at was the bachelor's degree approach that the council took. I'm going to skip over this because it is a lot, although if people have questions, I can return to that. So in order to think about how these different approaches would play out, the task force looked at 4 different scenarios that OSSI modeled that basically combined different approaches to changing the formula with changing the minimum salaries and how those things interact with each other. So I'm not going to go through each of those scenarios now. Those of you who were at Tuesday's meeting saw some of that, and all of this information will be posted on OSSI's website. But in looking at how these various things interacted, essentially the task force, in addition to affirming its support for the changes in the formula, looked at a couple of basic approaches to changing the minimum salaries. And basically what the sort of big takeaways from the models are that we can in fact meet the available funding levels, that $70 million ceiling, through a combination of proposing funding formula and minimum salary adjustments. Some of those details will need to be adjusted ongoing as we continue to get more data. The reality is that with any of the scenarios, almost all child development facilities will receive some level of decrease in award payments under any of the scenarios. We are cutting significant dollars, so the reality is that there's no way to do that without reducing payments. However, the amount that payments are reduced would vary significantly across facilities because of the way we're trying to target resources more equitably. And the other thing that I want to note is that in addition to those payments being reduced, at the same time, the costs for many facilities, for most facilities, would also be reduced by changing some of the minimum salaries. So the amount that the facility is required to expend would also reduce, even as some of the funds coming from OSSI are reduced. And the basic 2 approaches that the task force debated about and came to a sort of provisional recommendation again. One is to look at, in both cases, moving the less than CDA assistant teachers to minimum wage is included in both scenarios. But the scenario on the left would then, for everybody else, give them a 2% reduction, whereas the scenario on the right would focus on those teachers who have not yet gotten to the licensing requirement of the associate's degree, which is the minimum licensing requirement in centers and expanded homes. It would move those teachers to the same level as the CDA in the assistant teacher category. Based on the discussion at our last meeting, the task force coalesced around the second option. So that is where we are focusing the modeling to put together the report that we need to get to council. All of these are somewhat moving targets, so I don't want anyone to assume that this is all final. And regardless of what we recommend, the task force is only making recommendations, not decisions. So the mayor and council will need to establish what recommendations they're going to accept or any changes that they would make to that. So I know that was a lot, and I apologize for the degree of detail in there, but I think people need to be able to see the specifics. So I'm happy to answer questions when we get to that point.
Well, thank you, Abigail. And it was long, but it's important because, first of all, to commend you for leading the task force. It's not an easy job, and there are tough decisions. that may need to be made, but you've given us a very comprehensive overview of the deliberations and where you are to date. So we thank you for that. And I remind people that there's a button, a Q&A button at the bottom of the Zoom icon, so that if you have questions for Abigail, you can put them in there, and then we'll go into those questions later on in the teach-in. But thank you again. And now it's my pleasure to present our next panel of two outstanding leaders in the city and in the field who I work with on an ongoing basis, and starting with Jamal Berry, who is Educator DC's president and CEO. In 2013, Mr. Berry began his career with Educator DC as an infant and toddler mentor teacher, later becoming the school director and then vice president of programs. Over the years, he has applied his knowledge of leadership and early childhood development to steer Educator DC to earning high quality program ratings and to earning accreditation with the National Association for the Education of Young Children. Mr. Berry is an advocate for young children, as well as an early educator, and he is the convener of the DC Men and ECE organization, I might add. Second on the panel, we have Sally D'Italia. Sally's director of Arnold and Porter Children's Center and president of Emmy Education Consultants, as well as the co-chair of the DC Directors Exchange. For over 30 years, Sally has been an enthusiastic leader and advocate in the field of early learning and administration. In addition to operating a NAYC accredited early learning program for 28 years, her work involves supporting families and staff as a visionary leader and advocate for quality and access to quality early learning programs. Sally has been active in the DC early learning community, serving many roles and on numerous committees. And again, similar to Abigail's presentation, there is the Q&A button at the bottom of their Zoom. And we have asked Sally and Jamal, or Jamal and Sally, I reverse the order, to provide some guidance, because what Abigail has presented to us is really something. First of all, anytime you talk about pay, it's a hot topic, and it is an emotional topic. And as directors and leaders in the field, they've had hot topics they've had to deal with before and difficult conversations. And I was a former director of an early childhood program, and I've had difficult conversations. But one thing that I know about both of them, they will enter these conversations with grace, empathy, and truth-telling. So I pass it on to the two of you to give us some guidance on difficult conversations that leaders are going to have, whatever is the final decision of the task force. Thank you.
Thank you, Maurice, and thank you for the invite and for the opportunity for us to share with you today just some strategies or tips that we believe will be important in this communication to your teachers and to staff. So Sally and I are going to kind of ping back and forth through this just so that you hear both our voices, but we have 8 strategies that we've come up with. The first strategy is clear communication. As you just witnessed through Abigail's presentation, it's a lot. It's a lot of information. And so in clear communication, you need to be upfront with staff. You should not be talking about this in the last minute, right? So not in February when the dollars are changing, but as soon as the information goes out, you want to get in front of this. You want to explain the reasons for the cut, right? So you want to go back to when the mayor cut the budget, how the council replenished some of the budget. You want to talk through the steps of why the budget cuts has happened so that you are not to be blamed for this. And then you want to really be upfront about any anticipated changes in their compensation. So that's the first strategy we have for you. Sally?
Thanks, Jamal. And I want to extend my thanks to inviting
Just
us.
to ask everyone to pause for a moment. We have an interpreter down So if Travis, can you tell me what's going on so we can figure out whether we need to continue or pause for a moment?
We are just going to take a very brief pause. We have our Spanish interpreter, usually have two. Due to logistics, we have one tonight. So we're just going to take a break so our interpreter can drink water. That's it. We'll get back started soon. I'm going to take a brief moment to give a prompt for folks. Just a reminder on how to submit questions. We'll be getting started shortly in just a second. Okay. Diego is back. I will turn it back to you, Jamal and Sally.
Thanks, Travis. And again, I want to extend my thanks to inviting us on this very important topic. And I want to also support what Jamal said. You know, these changes, whatever goes into effect with the council, they're stressful. They're stressful on us as directors and owners. And it's also very stressful on our staff. And so the second strategy is just demonstrating empathy and support. It's, you know, I can't say enough about being empathetic with your staff. And, you know, there's a lot of information, as Abby shared. It is mind-boggling. There's a lot to take in. And even those of us as directors and business owners, and we're dealing with this and trying to manage the funds. And then it comes down to, how do we help our staff understand this? And it's scary, right? If you think about somebody talking about salaries being cut and you don't understand it, it's so important for us as leaders of programs to demonstrate empathy, and any messages that we send out there to be, you know, acknowledging that, like, we understand, we get it, you're scared. This is a scary world. And I think letting them know that you're available to listen, to hear their concerns, that can go a long way towards, you know, building trust and just working, you know, through it together to understand what's going on. I will turn it over to Jamal for the next idea.
Thank you, Sally. The third idea that we have is to engage staff in solutions. You know, if you're not part of the solution, you're part of the problem. And I think we can engage staff and have them to have agency on how to cope with some of these changes. That can foster a sense of ownership of, this is all of our problem and not just their problem, as well as, you know, even for like your leadership team, board members, other leaders, think about alternative funding opportunities. And that won't be across the board. That may not be, you know, where your organization is, but I would just encourage you to be innovative and to think about different options, but to include staff in the things that they can control. Once again, the salary may not be in their control, but how we cope with this change can be in our control. Sally?
Thanks, Jamal. So the fourth idea that we have is about focusing on what we do as early educators. I think it's so important, and this will go on to advocating for, you know, Abigail mentioned about there are so many advocates on this call, and Jamal and I are advocates for this field. And for the pay equity fund. And so remembering what it is we do as educators, the importance of our role, right? We are a part of the education continuum, and we have to remember that. And we have to keep our educators remembering that, the importance of what they do. We are the most important educators in a child's life between birth to 5 years of age, and we have to remember that. And the more we can emphasize that with our staff, it helps to then make them advocates, right? Advocate for themselves, find their voices, and together, it demonstrated when we got the $70 million back that was cut originally. We worked together because we understood our importance. So I think just reminding ourselves and our educators of how important we are in the lives of children and the families that we support. Jamal.
All right, number 5, provide resources. So if possible, think about some of the different resources for staff. I know somebody asked in the chat about talking points for leaders, and we can follow up with OSSI as well as with DC Early Learning Collaborative, maybe to come up with something, but I would use these 8 things and we can probably turn this into something. But for staff, I would provide resources. I would provide resources around a couple of different things. For staff that salaries may be cut, maybe providing some financial planning assistance and how to think about budgeting, right? So that they don't feel alone and in a silo. And then also remember that depending on which way the task force goes, there is this opportunity to meet the next level. And so if a certain level is cut because they are not meeting the criteria for that degree, then you can encourage them and provide resources to obtain the degree that aligns with licensing. So there's some opportunity there to provide resources as well. Sally?
So the next talking point is about creating a supportive environment. And again, this goes back to, educators are going to have lots of questions. There's going to be some uncertainty, and just creating an environment where educators, your staff, feel comfortable with expressing their concerns. This could be, providing regular check-ins. It could be, having different, maybe communities of practice to talk about this and to share feelings, to come up with ideas, to advocate for themselves. As Maurice mentioned at the beginning, a teach-in, the roots of it are, in the civil rights and about fighting for what is right. And so how do we create an environment for our educators that they feel comfortable with expressing themselves and maybe sharing ideas that they might say, well, gosh, my director's going to think I'm crazy for saying this. But how do we as directors create an environment that they can feel okay with saying something that might be out of the box, which might be a super brilliant idea. So just thinking about that, creating that supportive environment. Okay, Jamal.
Number 7, discuss future plans. There's a little bit of uncertainty there, right? But there is opportunity. And so we have a budget season next year. We have a committee of the whole opportunity where we can testify and we can figure out innovative things. And so, I would talk to staff about what is possible in the future. If your organization has a solution, whether that's additional funding, talk about it up front and let them know what the future might be, even though it isn't happening in the moment. But what I think that will do is it will give staff a sense of the bigger picture and can help to reduce feelings of uncertainty when you talk about what can happen further down the line. Sally?
And so the last one I kind of touched upon earlier, but it really is highlighting what are the benefits of early education and what part do our educators play in this. They, not just what they educators provide to young children, but also what they gain from it. It is it's about the relationships. It is about, being a part of a child's development. But also, again, recognizing their importance in the lives of these children, and then, finding their voice to say, yeah, we are important, right? We are not babysitters. We are not just people who sit on the floor and play with kids. We have an important role. We have an important role in the development of young children. We have an important role in the economics of the nation. And we need to be heard. And I think, giving people a safe place to feel that they have a voice, and then to encourage them to take that outside and continue to say, we are important. I think that can go such a long way to alleviating concerns and just working together as a community. Maybe combine with other directors, create your own community of practice and work together, somebody across, there's so many places that are so close together, join up and work together, and give your educators a place to speak, and give yourselves as directors a place to speak. I think that is going to be so important going forward as we continue to advocate for future funding and to make this all work together.
So in closing us out, we believe that focusing on these areas that directors can navigate this challenging situation more effectively can maintain staff morale, and then also can foster a sense of unity during these tough times. It's not just one site or one role that's being affected. And so this is an opportunity to come together and unite as one, which, going back to what Maurice said, back to the civil rights movement, that's what the teach-ins and sit-ins were all about. So we thank you for our time to be able to talk to you. And Maurice, we turn it back over to you, unless there's any questions that we need to answer.
It's going to Kim. We'll be
Sally.
back to you for questions.
Yes, Sally D'Italia, Jamal Berry, thank you both so very much. I just want to amplify what Crystal Powell said in the chat. I love the idea of talking points. It would be great to have a consistent message as one voice as we have clear communication about these changes. So thank you, Crystal, for noting that. And again, thank you, Sally D'Italia and Jamal Berry. We appreciate your leadership and your guidance, and we know that you all are there for early learning programs throughout this process. We are going to move on in the agenda. And next up is Director of Government Affairs, Joanna Blattner, with DC Action, who brings more than 15 years of experience as a social justice lobbyist, campaigner, and policy wonk, advocating for families at the local and federal levels. She most recently served as legislative director for DC Councilmember Janice Lewis George, where she managed a portfolio that included labor, housing, human services, public safety, early childhood education, health, taxes, and the district's annual budget. Joanna, we have been looking forward to you, who can lay out for folks on the call what happens next. What's the legislative process that needs to happen to codify these recommendations into law?
Great. Thank you so much for letting me speak. I'm sorry that I'm on camera and visual different. In terms of what's going to happen next for the legislative process, once the task force submits their recommendations to the council will then have the opportunity to review those recommendations, decide how to take those and input them into our DC laws or not. That is their decision, as Abigail shared. But what will happen typically in a process, if the council does want to go through with making revisions to the pay equity components of our DC law, is that they will introduce what's called emergency legislation. Emergency legislation allows the DC Council to bypass some of the longer procedural processes involved with passing a permanent piece of legislation. It avoids having to go through hearings. It avoids having to do congressional review, because we are not a state and Congress still reviews all of our laws. And it allows for what they pass to go into effect much quicker. Emergency legislation is active for 30 days in the city. But in addition to the emergency bill, what they also pass is what's called a temporary piece of legislation. And temporary bills are in effect for 225 days. So in theory, what will happen is the council will receive the recommendations. They will make decisions about what they want to take of the recommendations and codify into law. And I'll go into that in a little bit more detail in a second. They'll pass emergency legislation likely sometime in October. There are 2 legislative meetings that happen in October. The most likely one I think that we should be thinking about is October 15th, because the first one is October 1st. That feels a little bit too soon for them to be able to move on, but I've seen wilder things happen. In addition to passing that emergency piece of legislation, they would also then pass temporary legislation for to be in effect for longer. That temporary legislation should then be able to tide us over until our next budget season, which will happen in the spring. The budget will come down from the mayor in March. And my best guess is what will happen is in the what's called the Budget Support Act, complementary legislation to the dollar figures of our budget, that we will pass a permanent version of the changes to the Pay Equity Fund portion of the law through that Budget Support Act next year. But it is important for the emergency legislation to happen this fall so that we're not seeing those really major cuts happening to the BA teachers, for example, which was passed in the previous Budget Support Act, as Abigail had laid out, as well as other kind of changes that were codified previously. So this allows us to go back potentially to the funding adjustments that the task force came up with, which is I think, less harsh version of the pay cuts and the pay changes that we're going to be seeing. In terms of the content of what would be in that emergency legislation, the most important thing that they're going to change are this actual salary minimum numbers. Right now in law, there are 2 tables in the like Excel sheet kind of tables in the law that lay out the salary ranges for assistant teachers and a salary range for lead teachers, as well as home care providers. And so it would be a matter of updating the minimum salaries per role and per credential in that law. There's a lot that the executive agencies at OSSI has flexibility to adjust in the pay equity funding formula without the DC Council having to pass law to spell out all of those exact nuances of the funding formula. But those salary scale minimums are the main thing that I would expect to see altered in emergency legislation. And I also want to note that it is very important for those salary scale tables to remain in the legislation, because it is a safer way to protect the salary scale and the salary minimums than having that removed entirely, because OSSI could decide to change the salary minimums on their own without public kind of awareness, but having that those minimums codified in law makes sure that if any changes need to happen, that there is a public, transparent process for you all as directors to be aware of, and for our educators to be aware of, and for our Under 3 Coalition to be advocating around. So that is sort of what I expect to see as the process moving forward. And I'm happy to answer questions when the Q&A comes up.
Joanna, thank you very much. We appreciate the update. We'll ask all of our panelists to come back on screen. We have a few questions. Audrey Castleman is helping to pull questions out. And our first question is to Abby from Brandy Perillo, who says, can employers reduce employees' salaries?
So any provider that is participating in the Pay Equity Fund must pay the minimum salaries that that are in those charts that Joanna just referred to. So the minimum salaries that have been established for the current Pay Equity Fund, they don't have to pay more than that, but they have to pay it. They could pay more than that, but they have to pay at least the minimum salaries. And that will continue to be the case with whatever changes are made to the Pay Equity Fund, although those minimum salaries may change.
Thank you. Next question is from Mercedes Garcia, who says she wonders if you can talk about if there were educators on the task force. It's the question that $2 million for the administration seems like a lot. And maybe you can talk about how those dollars are spent.
Sure. In terms of who is on the task force, yes, the task force includes, I don't have a number, right? I'm not going to get the number exactly right, but it includes a significant number of both directors and owners. So Sally, for example, Sally and Jamal are both on the task force, which we're very lucky to have. 2 child development home or expanded home owners are also on the task force. 2 additional educators who are classroom educators in centers are on the task force. And I may be missing a couple of folks. So that voice is very much there. In terms of the numbers for, I hear Mercedes' question around $2 million sounds like a lot of money, and it is a lot of money. They were allocated up to $3.5 million. And in looking at both what the staffing is required, that the staffing that OSSI needs to be able to do all of the work to administer the program, and all of the monitoring and the technology that's required, the computer or the what am I trying to say? Like the IT systems, IT, that's the word I'm looking for. That those are the costs that OSSI defined. I think that everyone is certainly free to sort of assess whether that seems like a lot of money or not enough money. But in allowing in identifying that amount of money, it freed up $1.5 million, $1.5 million that were not originally allocated towards the facility funding. So I think that the task force felt pretty good about that move.
Thank you. Cynthia Davis asks, can we get a copy of the tables? And so Abby, those are all in your presentation?
Yes. So Cynthia, the tables that you have in all of our decks, that is the same for what the minimum salaries are. That is the same table that Joanna is referring to. What tables will be in the new BSA, that has yet to be determined. But the tables that are currently in law are the same ones that we've been looking at for all the minimum salaries.
Okay. Next question. Will salaries change for teachers who have degrees in other fields other than early childhood education? For example, a teacher with a degree in science with only 12 credit hours in ECE is getting paid the same amount as teachers who have a degree in ECE or a related field.
So here's what I will say, and I'm gonna stop short of giving a definitive answer because that definitely is an OSCE question, but here's my understanding, and Sally and Jamal can jump in. So right now, the challenge is that because of what was written in those tables, the credential definition, the definitions of credentials for the pay equity fund are not exactly the same as the definition of the credentials for OSCE's current licensing regulations. So included in that is, I think, the example that this person is giving, which is right now in the pay equity fund for an AA, if you have at least sorry, I think it's at least 24 credit hours in early childhood education, and the current licensing requirements are actually only 12 hours in early childhood. So this would align it with the licensing standards, so that those teachers would have access to the associate's degree level pay. But Sally and Jamal, you should jump in if I'm getting that wrong.
I think that's our understanding too. Yeah.
Okay. Also, Cynthia Davis made it clear that actually her question about the tables was for Joanna. The
Thanks.
table scares was for Joanna about the law.
Sorry, thanks. I put the link to the law in the chat. That is where the current pay equity authorizing language lives, and that's where I expect to see amendments. So hopefully everyone can grab that if you have questions, and the tables are in there.
Thanks, Joanna. Next question says, we need to have a way to advocate for these funds to grow. We should not be held at the 70 million with a growing profession. Let's think of the children and those who care for them. Do not diminish me because I care for young children. I develop brains for the future. We must be respected for that. And a praxis exam will not change that or cannot be compared. Amen to that. So that wasn't a question. That was a very strong statement. And we hear you, we agree with you, and we are here to fight with you. The next question is pay equity payout for a small center with less than 16 enrolled or have capacity for 16 is not sustainable. Do you have numbers of centers that have closed because of pay equity implementation?
I do not have any information on that. We could ask OSCE if they have that information, but I'm not aware of it.
I would also
Sally,
just
Jamal.
reframe that just a little bit, just because I don't know if we can say any centers have closed because of pay equity, because there was the opportunity for sites to do a waiver. I think it has put pressure on the system, but there were different opportunities for those who could not meet the minimum requirement to put in waivers. So but the numbers around just how many centers have closed, from a certain point in time is something that OSCE could give us.
Okay, thank you, Jamal. Can programs still participate, or teachers, in the pay equity fund if they don't have a CDA?
Yes.
Oh, yeah.
Yes, they could. I mean, it's just that they have to recognize that they would not, based upon the recommendations of the task force going forward, that any assistant teacher who does not have a CDA, the program would not receive any pay equity funds to pay them an increased salary, as was in the FY24 pay equity fund. So it would be up to the program to, obviously by law, it would have to be at least minimum wage. If a program could pay more, then they could, but they would, the program itself would not receive any pay equity funds for that educator, based upon the recommendations of the task force.
Thank you,
And
Stephanie.
I want to just point out that, again, emphasizing that there's so many resources out there for those educators to achieve that CDA, and they are free.
And we can send those out with the follow-up materials as well. Might be a good reminder. When are you required to pay staff the minimum required wages? When the employer gets the funds or when staff is hired?
When they are approved in the system by OSSI. So it's very complicated, but when an educator gets hired, all of their documentation and everything has to be uploaded into the Division of Early Learning system. And then there's somebody on OSSI's end who looks at all of those qualifications. So they're looking at your resume, they're looking at your credentials. So whether you're got your AA or whatever. So they are determining what level you are qualified at. Once OSSI says, yes, you are an assistant teacher with a CDA, or yes, you are a lead teacher with an AA, then the program must start paying the educator at the minimum salary that is outlined in the pay equity fund for that position with the credential.
And as a suggestion, I would create, as a program, I would create an internal policy. So that's just clear to staff on what your policy is for when you pay. So for example, if staff get an updated or an increased certification before the next quarter, we have created a policy where they will receive it at the point in time of the quarter, because then we know that they are that the program is receiving those funds. So I think you should create an internal policy that you share with staff that creates transparency.
And Jamal, are there examples of those that we could share and follow up as well?
Yeah, I'm sure we could pass some of those on.
Okay, thank you for that. Next question is, what happens to centers that have an extension, but some teachers earn the amount and others do not have the corresponding payment? I'm a lead teacher and I have an associate. Who can I follow up with? Can someone help? Is that an OSSI question?
Yeah, I think that's an OSSI question.
Okay. So we will be sure to forward OSSI's number as a reminder to folks. I know most folks have it, but we'll send that in the follow-up as well. Are the problems connected to the historical issues the ECE field has been facing? This is like a good Maurice question.
Yeah, is it in terms of salaries and why we're not getting paid what we should be getting paid? Go ahead, Maurice. This is
No, the answer is yes, and it's universal. I mean, it's not just DC. It is national and international in terms of low wages.
In my work, ITERs came to evaluate my work as a professional in childcare. Can the result of ITERs observations affect my salary?
No.
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 Thank you. When will we know that the recommendations have been approved and ready for implementation?
You want to take that, Joanna?
Joanna. Are you adding your audio back in?
Sorry,
Okay.
having my audio issues. So the way that we will know that they have been approved and things are moving forward is that the council will circulate emergency legislation. They circulate legislation for consideration by their colleagues before a legislative meeting. It is my hope, and I will be down at the council on a probably daily basis in October to stay on top of them. But it is my hope that they will let us know well in advance when the chairman and his colleagues feel like they have reviewed the recommendations, have either agreed with the recommendations and how to move forward with emergency legislation, or if they want to go a very different direction, they will hopefully keep us posted on what that looks like. And we will be able to let you all know that, you know, they are moving forward as is with the recommendations, or going in a different direction, or something in between. The other person who is a factor here is the chief financial officer of the city. Their office was also part of the challenge of why the Pay Equity Fund was eliminated last year. And so, you know, he will have to make sure that the recommendations that are put forward do in fact fit within the 70 million, and that the recommendations or the legislation from the council that reflects the recommendations, again, fits within that financial amount. I am hopeful that OSSI has been working with the chief financial officer on coming up with the calculations and certifying that everything will fit. But that is a sort of potential unknown of in the mix. But as soon as we hear anything, the Under 3 Coalition will let folks know what to expect. And, you know, again, if I had to read tea leaves, October 15th legislative meeting is my best guess of when things would start to, when we would see things move.
Thank you, Joanna. Raul Echeverria asks, I have a question about potential implementation of the high tuition cutoffs. How exactly would potential cutoff for high tuition be established? Some centers may have high tuition, but take a significant number of subsidy students and P-Keep students who provide income well below the posted tuition.
So again, this is still at the, you know, provisional recommendation level, so I want to be clear on that. But I think the basic concept would be for programs that are above that 90th percentile. And that's based on the market survey that OSSI did in 2023. That those programs would still be eligible for most of the pay equity funding, but portions of it would not be. And I think in the example that you just provided, Kim, the fact that someone is serving subsidy children would mean that they would get additional funds through the pay equity fund for subsidy. So that is definitely taken into account, and that based on our current recommendations that we're considering additional amount for subsidy than the current. The reality is that there's so many different variations in the market, as all of you know. Every center and every home is different and has its specific financial scenario. So it is very hard to predict exactly how it would look. But the bit is that that serving subsidy kids would allow you to access to additional pay equity fund dollars that would hopefully counter that challenge.
Thank you, Abby. Tamika Robinson asks, what would determine which proposed model of pay equity the task force will choose to take to the city council or the mayor? So maybe just repeating
So the task force in its meeting on this last Tuesday gave provisional approval for several of the recommendations in there. There are some pieces that we did not get to, and so task force members are continuing to work on that. But our basic approach is a consensus model, meaning that we try to come to agreement of everybody in the group, which may not mean that everybody completely agrees, but the people who have some concerns recognize that most folks are in support of a particular approach, and so will agree to support the overall recommendations. And so far, all of the things that we've talked about have been a consensus recommendation.
Margarita Minhee asks, so everything will remain the same with our salary until December of this year?
Correct.
Keisha Spencer asks, will teachers that have put in a waiver still be able to receive the pay equity?
Based upon our recommendation, so if it's a waiver for continuous service or a waiver for time to reach your credential, no. If you had a less than a CDA, then you would not receive pay equity funds. This is for FY25. If you have if you don't have an AA but are a lead teacher, and you only had a CDA as a lead teacher, you would be paid at the CDA level, which is approximately $51,000. However, if once you reach the credential for your position, then yes, you would be eligible for the pay equity funds at that for the role and the credential.
Thank you, Sally. All right, we reached the end of the time we have for questions. We do want to, well, let's move on. Maurice is going to cover some next steps.
Yes, and
Travis
so
will share
we
the
have the slides for the next steps. And as we transition into the slides, because there's something that Jamal said that I just want to remind you. The reason that we use a teach-in as the conceptual framework for these meetings is because it is a place we go to learn in order to take action, and it does draw from the civil rights movement. And regardless as to what the final recommendations are from the task force, we have, and it was embedded in a lot of the questions, people are committed to doing the work that is in front of us. And while we've made great strides, we are going to be calling upon you to help us. Is that right, Travis? We will be calling on you to help us move this agenda forward, because we've only just begun in many ways. And we've made some progress, but the same number of people who were on this call need to be with us as we try to move the agenda through the budgetary process and whatever else happens after this. I'm looking to you, Travis, for yes.
Yes, yes. So when the task force releases their recommendations, just a few days after, we will be letting the whole early education sector know, parents, educators, owners, how they can contact the council based on what are in the recommendations and what we want the council to do next. So stay tuned. We are ready to move fast once these recommendations come out.
Well, thank you all. Is there any other things that we need to talk about this evening? Kim?
Yes. Travis, do we want to talk about the third?
Yes, I will make a quick plug. In the chat, we are dropping a link where you can RSVP to our next coalition call, Thursday, October 3rd at 6:30 p.m. Eastern. This will be 72 hours after the task force releases their recommendations, if they stick to the September 30th deadline. Don't worry, a day or two after the task force releases those recommendations, we will send you our analysis via email. And then just a day later, that next coalition call, is your next opportunity to hear live from us our analysis of the final recommendations, to have us answer your questions, and for you to hear about the multiple opportunities to get loud and get vocal about contacting the council and what we want them to do to stabilize the pay equity fund. And I will turn it back to our host.
Well, thank you for coming, and stay connected with this work. It's important work, and it's for the children, ultimately.
That's
Kim?
right. Thank you all for being such powerful leaders for our children and families. We'll see you next time, and we'll be following up with materials. Have a really good evening and be safe. We'll see you next time.
Bye.